Our four panelists, and I will introduce them in alphabetical order, have a lot of experience in this field, and we'll start with me putting some questions to them, but then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. First, retired Army Colonel Charles D. Allen is the Professor of Leadership and Cultural Studies in the Department of Command, Leadership, and Management at the U.S. Army War College. Chuck recently ended a 30-year Army career as Director of Leader Development. He also served as an instructor and Assistant Professor of Engineering Management at West Point. He's a 1978 graduate of West Point. He had 11 years of overseas assignments in Germany, Honduras, and South Korea. His military education also includes the Army War College, the Command General Staff College, the School of Advanced Military Studies, and the U.S. Army War College. Chuck has served in leadership and staff positions from platoon through corps in Army and Joint Commands, and he's also got extensive experience with the National Guard. Vivian Greentree is the Director of Research and Policy for Blue Star Families, a group founded by military spouses with the mission of raising awareness of the challenges of military family life. She's a Navy veteran, she's a military spouse, and she's currently writing her dissertation for her PhD in Public Administration and Urban Policy, where her areas of public policy research include civic engagement and public service motivation. She's also a contributing writer to several military print and online outlets, and she's been asked for input and analysis for articles in both civilian and military media outlets. Peter Mansour is the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at Ohio State University. The retired Army Colonel ended a 26-year career as the Executive Officer to General David H. Petraeus. You've heard of him. He was then the Commanding General of Multinational Force Iraq. Pete was a 1982 distinguished graduate at West Point, and he served in a variety of command and staff positions in the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East. During his military career from 2003 to 2005, he commanded the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, including 13 months of counterinsurgency duty in Iraq. He served as the founding director of the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Center, and in the fall of 2006, he served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff Council of Colonels that re-examined the strategy for the war in Iraq. And finally, David R. Siegel. He's a professor of sociology, director of the Center for Research on Military Organization, and faculty affiliate in the Department of Government and Politics at the School of Public Affairs and Maryland Population Research Center. All of those are at the University of Maryland. His visiting appointments include guest scientists at Walter Reed, distinguished lecturer and distinguished visiting professor at West Point, and the SLA Marshall Chair at the U.S. Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences. He's won numerous professional and teaching awards and has twice been awarded the Department of the Army Medal for Outstanding Civilian Service. That was in '89 and in 2000. And his public service includes Special Assistant for Peace Operations to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in 1994 to 96, and 2 terms on the Board of Visitors at the U.S. Army War College. Whew. There's more on them in the information booklets you've been handed. Well, let's start with you, David, since we introduced you last. More than 8 in 10 of the post-9/11 veterans, 84% in fact, in this Pew survey say the American public has little or no understanding of the problems faced by those in the military, and a large majority of that public agrees. Does this seem fundamentally different to you from earlier generations of veterans? And if so, why?
The fundamental difference, I believe, is not between veterans of the current wars versus earlier veterans, so much as it's a reflection of the difference between having a conscription-based army and an all-volunteer force. In our surveys, we began to see the change starting in the early 1970s. Because of, I think, 2 major differences in the 2 kinds of forces. First of all, the previous conscription-based army during the Cold War was a larger force, and it was therefore a more visible presence in American society. Secondly, because it was based on conscription, there was a constant flow of young people coming out of our communities, out of our families, into the military, and then returning back to to their civilian communities. With the advent of the all-volunteer force, we have fewer people serving. Those who serve longer. They're not as quick to return to the civilian community, and they're therefore not as visible. There are basically fewer of them. There's also less of a sense of understanding of what the military does, and I think matched with a sense that people don't know. I was very, very reassured to find that Americans said they don't understand what's going on with the military. When I first got into this business, and I got into this business before we had an all-volunteer force, when civilians were asked if they understood what the military does, their image was not only the Cold War, but the two mid-century wars, when the image of the soldier was an infantryman. Technology wasn't very complex, and they kind of had an understanding of what soldiers did. Now they read about drones. Well, what are drones, and what is the role of soldiers in flying drones, and how many soldiers are infantrymen? And particularly given the nature of the current wars and the change in warfare from conventional wars to fighting insurrections and counterinsurgency. Certainly the older generation grew up thinking about conventional battlefields with a forward edge of the battle area, and soldiers are there, and there are soldiers in rear areas, and gee, we get that. And to understand a war where once you put your boots on the ground, you're in the battle zone, that doesn't fit the old paradigm. So they know that the paradigm has changed. I think they don't understand what the change has been. So there have been, I think, two important inflection points. One was the change from conscription to a volunteer force back in 1973-74. And the second, the change from conventional warfare, which we experienced that change in Vietnam but didn't acknowledge it, and in fact elected not to learn the lessons of Vietnam and had to relearn them in the current conflicts. But they now know that the nature of warfare has changed, and they know that they don't know what is involved.
I'd like to kind of add a historical viewpoint, because before we say that there's this huge gap between the military and the civilians and the republic's going to collapse, I think it bears looking back at our own history. The draft is an anomaly in American history. 1863 to 1865, 3 years. 1917, 1918, 2 years. 1940 to 1973, 34 years. You add all that up, that's 39 years. You subtract the number of years our republic has been in existence, and you end up with 196 years that we relied on volunteers to staff our military and to fight our wars. To include some very lengthy wars in the Philippine Islands, to include the Moro uprising afterwards, after the Philippine insurrection, the Indian Wars of the American West, which Rick talked about up front. So what we're going through may seem new to us, but it's not new to Americans. And what I think is we are reverting to more of the norm of American history, which is a reliance on a long-serving volunteer force. And I don't think it signals any sort of collapse of the American Republic.
Vivian, let me ask you a really fundamental question. Does the inequity of shared sacrifice matter? I mean, we see in these survey results that even if more than 4 in 5 Americans acknowledge that the sacrifice borne by the military and their families since 9/11, only 1 in 4 describe that as unfair. And a substantial majority, 70% in fact, say it is just part of being in the military. What does this tell us about the civil military structure that we've built?
Well, I would say yes, it does matter in so much that we value public service in general outside of the military and public service of any kind. We risk, as Admiral Mullen said, othering each other. I fear that they don't understand us. Our Blue Star families did a survey of military families last year, and 92% of the respondents agreed that the general public doesn't understand or appreciate the unique challenges faced by modern-day military families. And so I think that it is there. It was interesting to me to see that the public also said the same thing, because what we were interpreting was thinking that the civilian community would largely say, yes, of course we support the military, and 91% said they had, but then when you look at the stair step down, well, what's the next thing from appreciating the service member? Then you maybe say thank you, but have you done anything? Then it stair steps down lower. So I do wonder how much of it is saying they're appreciative, but then not wanting their children to join the military.
Chuck, does it matter, inequity?
I think it does matter. Again, we say the military should represent the population which it serves. When you have a disconnection between those who serve and those that they serve, then that may be a problem. I know we have a representative from the VA that talks about, I think, 400,000 plus veterans are under the VA care. 318 or so thousand receive disability allotment. So that's a big bill to pay, right? We're talking about changes in our economy, constraints on maybe some resourcing. We got to pay this bill sometime. And if it's a challenge of paying to care for vets who are not part of society because they chose to do it on their own, that may be an issue for us to address.
I know you have something to say for
I want to take issue with this disconnect that somehow Americans don't know about the military. Page 80 or 66 of this study had a really astounding figure that I would never have guessed these numbers. But the question is, what's the percentage of the public who have friends and family who are veterans? Those who have a close friend or family member who has served in Iraq or Afghanistan, 57%. Those who have an immediate family member who is a veteran from any era, 61%. Those who have a more distant relative, and we're talking like cousins and uncles now, who are veterans from any era, 79%. I don't think those numbers show a disconnect at all. And so I would just take exception that somehow there's this growing gap between the military and the American society.
Well, then how do you square the circle of people in overwhelming numbers saying that they don't understand the military, that they concede that they don't know that world?
Well, they don't. They haven't walked in our shoes. They haven't served in uniform. They might know someone in uniform, but then maybe they haven't talked to them at length about what it means to move around 17 times in 26 years, which is what I did, and have your kids go to 10 different schools in their 12 years of schooling. I mean, that sort of thing just kind of goes over the head, but it doesn't mean they don't appreciate the sacrifices. It doesn't mean that they somehow see the military as an outcast of American society, which I would contend that in the 19th century they did see the military as somehow the outcasts of American society. We're a long way from that.
Can I follow up on
David.
that, please? Because I sort of bristle at the term culture gap. I think it is clear that there's a lack of understanding, and there's an appreciation that there is a lack of understanding. But I was also impressed by how closely the attitudes of the military personnel and the veterans and the civilians actually were. And the fact that where there were differences, they were largely explained by differences in the selection process for the military, self-selection process. The fact that people who go into the military are more likely to see themselves more conservative. They are more likely to see themselves as Republicans. And in fact, when you control for those factors, the differences between veterans and non-veterans pretty much disappears. So to say that there's a gap, back in the 1990s, there were a lot of journalists and social scientists who were saying there was a culture gap. Yesterday in a graduate seminar, I challenged my students, 15 of whom are currently serving officers, to tell me how they would know if there was a culture gap between the military and civilian society. And they couldn't come up with a good measure. They could recognize that there's a difference in perceptions, but that's different than saying there's a culture gap. As far as the 48% who say they would recommend to young people close to them to join the military, I kind of wonder what occupation in the United States would come up with a higher figure. I'm pretty sure that if people asked their sons and daughters, or recommended to their sons and daughters, that they go out and be sociology professors, we'd be down in the single digits. I suspect that if the question was, would you recommend that your son or daughter go into law or medicine, you'd get into double digits, but I'm not sure you'd get anywhere near 48%. So I think that 48% figure is probably high relative to what other occupations might get.
Paul and I know that the figure would be in the negative numbers if we asked about journalism.
Well, Rick, about 2 years ago, you and I sat at a panel in Boston College in Mass Humanities, and there's a concern again from certain sectors of society, to include academics, that there is a disconnect between what the educators understand about the military and what society understands about the military. And that was a full one-day panel we had out in Boston, and there was a lot of concern about that. The question is, will we have our society members who are the elite, and they're not involved in the process of making decisions or sacrificing their children to go into service? That concerns them. For academics who are teaching at Ivy League schools, they don't see military students in the classroom, how they connected with their students with the greater part of society. That was a concern at a very substantial cohort 2 years ago.
I mean, if you don't know this world, however you define that, if you don't know, if you have no direct experience in the military, can you make sensible civic decisions about things military? Is that a hazard where of 312 million people, there's a relatively small number who actually understand the nuances?
Well, back in the 1990s, when there was a debate going on, one of the concerns was the diminishing number of people sitting in our legislative bodies who had military experience, not necessarily having been career military, but having served a term in the military and walking in the shoes of soldiers. And clearly there has been a decline over time in the number of generals who sit in the Congress. And yeah, I think that is a concern. I think that the people who are making decisions to deploy our military forces and fund our military forces should have a sense of what deployments and military equipment means. I see veterans as an important vehicle of civil-military relations in the United States. They're a group that weaves the military into the broader fabric of society, which is a role that we used to sort of say the conscripts do that. You know, they go into the military, they come back, they return to civilian society. Well, the veterans still do it. The reserve components do it. And I think one of the things that has improved civil-military relations in the current wars is that, in fact, we have mobilized our reserve components and used them in their military role, not simply for domestic disasters, but in fact for overseas operations. Because the experience that they bring back to their communities, which frequently have nobody else in the military serving, I think helps educate their friends, their neighbors, as to what is involved in the military.
Other thoughts on this?
Well, again, going back, our Constitution, by the way, gives authority to the Commander-in-Chief, who's a civilian, and the people who wrote the Constitution didn't have an expectation that the folks in Congress would be serving, would be veterans. Some of our greatest wartime presidents have had no military service. So is it desirable to have folks in Congress who have a sense of what the military is all about? Absolutely. And we may get more now that we have veterans returning from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan running for Congress. There's a couple, I know Representative West in Florida was in the 4th Infantry Division. There's others. So we may have seen the low point. We'll see about that. But I don't think, again, that it should be the sine qua non of you can't make a decision regarding military affairs unless you've served in the military, because then our republic really would collapse.
Does it become easier, though, to commit the force to combat if you don't really know what combat is about?
I think it's a different issue, that it's easier to commit the force to combat when it's a volunteer force, because you then aren't necessarily affecting a broad swath of the American people when the body bags start to come home. And people, as they did in the survey, said, well, that's just, you signed up for that, it's part of the military service. And then it does become easier in that sense.
And it would have also been interesting to add the question of, would you support a war tax, or would you support, and then list other things besides shaking hands or saying thank you in an airport, to truly support the military. Good
idea, actually. So should we think about the military the same way we think about police or fire? Is there a substantive difference in military service in terms of first responders? Chuck?
I think there's a big difference, again, with the first responders as a day-to-day activity, expectation, though they're there to help and serve people, but the loss of life is probably not present, ever present. If you look at students now at the War College, we've had 25 or so years of service. They probably have 7 or 8 different types of deployments, both pre-9/11 and post-9/11. Folks who've been enlisted in the Army since 2001 have at least 2 or 3 deployments. And with that, you have this constant threat of death or injury, even though the numbers are pretty large, that looms over them largely, pretty substantially, and then that also affects their families.
Right, to follow up with the families, one of my fellow Blue Star family directors, we were talking beforehand, because I said, is there a difference between the military families and first responders? And I thought back to our survey results, where the top issues for military families are effects of deployment on children, the military's lifestyle effect on their educational attainment, and military spouse employment. 49% had said that they had felt adverse effects for being a military spouse. And you wouldn't find that, I don't think, in other families of first responders. And so it's unique in that the sustained deployments, the amount, the op tempo is different. And while there is a lot that does overlap, the fear for security and life is there, but there is enough different, I think, to where it makes it a unique experience.
Right. The other part, there's a trauma associated. Again, the report said that about 50% witnessed a killing or death of a friend. They were involved in some activity that they felt ashamed of. You might not have that in the fire department or local police department. When you have this, again, involvement in conflict and the moral hazard, those things stay with you. You mentioned that up front. It stays with you, which is different than a fireman in the police department, I believe.
David?
The family stresses are not simply a function of the current deployments and the operational tempo. They clearly have made military life more stressful, but the basic problems are there in peacetime. And the fundamental problem, for example, with adjustment of adolescence or spouse employment is in fact frequent relocation. And we kind of lose sight of the fact that a majority of military spouses who are employed are in jobs that require credentialing of some kind, whether they're cosmetologists or dental hygienists or attorneys. And credentialing is generally a state's right issue. And if the military moves them from one state to another, either as a cosmetologist or as an attorney, they have to start again to get credentialed to practice in that state. I mean, we've done a good deal of research on military spouse employment. Military spouses, by the way, as a group, are more educated than comparable spouses of civilian men, but they have higher unemployment rates. They have higher underemployment rates. They have higher rates of giving up and leaving the labor force. And when they remain employed, they get less of a return to their level of education than do civilians. I mean, the entire employment deck is stacked against them.
And as an Army brat, I can tell you that you can put in 18 years as a dependent and there's no damn pension. So let me ask the two colonels, retired colonels, do veterans sufficiently recognize and acknowledge that by enlisting or accepting a commission that they've agreed to take on most of the national burden when it comes to waging near perpetual war? Did your soldiers know that in the brigade?
I think that soldiers do recognize that. In fact, most of them signed up knowing they could go to war. My brigade was there in one of the very early rotations, so it was still sort of new. Having gone back in 07, 08, when some people were on their third rotation, it was wearing on them. And there was a little bit of grumbling, but again, the expectation is that you're a long service professional, and if you want to stay in, you're going to have to do these deployments. Now, it gets to a wider national debate during the Iraq War anyways, did we have a big enough military? Because we didn't do anything to expand the force when we went into Iraq, and then we, for too long, put blinders on as to what kind of war we were in and the fact that it would be a lengthy war. So the issue was that there just wasn't enough forces, and then we got into longer and longer deployments. Eventually, deployments exceeding the length of time people spent at home during the surge, 15 months overseas for 12 months at home. And it was pretty brutal. And that leads to all sorts of stresses on the force, higher divorce rate, suicides, and other things that we saw go on. But the expectation still is if you join the military, you're joining to be a long service professional. If you stay in, and you're going to be deployed.
Chuck?
Pete and I went to the same school many years ago, so as an academy graduate, again, we understood this profession of the arms. Had a chance to teach at West Point back in the mid-'80s. Again, folks saw themselves coming to a calling, right, serving their nation. And now I'm teaching at the Army War College, and I have students, again, that have been in service for 20-some years, and they're going back into the mix. They understand what they signed up for, to serve the nation, to take care of soldiers, and to be responsible stewards. So they know what it costs. Part of the conversation is that the Army has been at war for about 10 years here, pretty consistently. And folks feel that maybe American people don't appreciate that, and they haven't sacrificed. I'll submit that the soldiers that I know, officers and NCOs, don't want their American citizens to sacrifice. They signed up for this. They're trying to protect and defend. So I think they realize the burden that they're going to carry, and they willingly accept it.
David, the Pew results seem to suggest that we don't confuse the warrior with the war, as we did so frequently in Vietnam. 90% plus voice admiration for the military, even when less than half support the two current wars. Why the sea change?
In a sense, we've gotten more sophisticated as a country, I think. But if you recall the results on the public evaluation of institutions, even if you go back to the Vietnam period, the military was one of the most trusted institutions. Now, back then, it wasn't trusted as much as the Congress, which I don't remember the Congress back then. But it certainly was trusted more than most other American institutions, including churches, including education. So we have a history of trusting our military. We didn't trust it as much then. I think we have gotten more sophisticated. I think that we learned a lesson from the anti-war movement during Vietnam, that given that then our army was largely conscripts, we finally figured out that they didn't choose the wars that they fought. They fought the wars that the nation sent them to fight. And the turning point that I saw was, in fact, the first Gulf War, when for the first time the peace movement started taking as a motto, support our troops, bring them home, which was different than our soldiers are baby killers. And that theme has persisted in the peace movement. So that there has been a sense that, yes, we have an obligation to support our soldiers. They are America's sons and daughters, even if we don't like the wars that they're being sent to fight. You know, that's an issue that we may have with the civilians who send them, but it's not their fault.
Vivian?
Yes, I mean, I think it shows the professionalization of the military, where it is volunteer, and also I think it shows as the veterans are using their GI Bills and going back to higher education and to universities around the country, and they're talking about their experiences, and this whole next generation that might not have had any experience with the military is seeing they fight for what's behind them, not because of what's in front of them. And they go to war because that's who, you know, it doesn't matter who's in power, who chooses, but that's their job. So it's nice to see that our veterans of today are not maybe experiencing the same things that some of our earlier veterans did.